These are the things that I want to do in this lecture. I'm hoping that I'm going to ask more questions than I answer, and that I'll be able to give you the material here that will prompt you into thinking, rationalising what the answers might be. But at the same time, I'm also aiming to give you the background that you need to understand why it is that so many biographies have been written about Darwin and why they're so diverse. But before we get underway, I thought I'd just run one last counterfactual by you that has some degree of biographical import. Enjoy another wonderful moment of the Dawkins. I'd like to tell a little story at this point. Some of you will know who this particular figure is. It's T.H. Huxley, standing by a chalkboard where he's done a wonderful illustration of a gorilla, one of his favourite subjects. And of course, what Huxley was known as was Darwin's bulldog, the man who at all costs defended Darwin's ideas. Today, we can think of Richard Dawkins as being Darwin's bulldog the second. And of course his job is to defend Darwin and to attack those enemies of Darwinism like the creationists and other non-atheists. Dawkins is an extraordinary figure. He has an incredible level of self-confidence and self-belief. He cannot be accused of not speaking his mind. This is Andrew Brown, a commentator on all things evolution, a journalist whose work you can often find in The Guardian, talking about Dawkins, about his contagious enthusiasm, which can't be explained by his genes. So let's tell a different sort of story. Now, of course, the irony in this statement is that Dawkins is on record as saying that everything about him or anyone else can be explained by the genes. So Andrew Brown's little story, actual fairy tale, is this. When he was born in Nairobi in 1941, the fairies gathered around his cradle. The good fairy gave him good looks, intelligence, fame, a succession of beautiful wives, a chair at Oxford, specially endowed for him. The bad fairy studied him a while and said, "Give him a gift for metaphor." Those of you that read Dawkins's work will understand that metaphor is all over the place. I mean, a gene can't be selfish, for example, because selfishness is a human trait. A gene can't have any level of affectivity. So in fact, the selfish gene itself is a huge metaphor that somehow gets collapsed into reality. So Richard Dawkins' gift for metaphor, and he is an extremely good writer, has often got him into large amounts of trouble. But that's not what I want to talk about now with Dawkins. What I want to talk about is a little counterfactual that you can find online at this address. He starts off with the issue that Darwin didn't have a decent mechanism for inheritance, and that it was only when Mendelian genetics came along and then got incorporated into Darwinism during the 1920s that we had an adequate mechanism allowed us to see how natural selection and genetics work together. And he says, imagining the kind of person that Darwin was, his own imagination, his own biographical image of Darwin, it's also nice to think that he might have been pleased about kin selection and selfish genes as well. And then he relates this story about how some time ago he had been interviewed by a Japanese television company, and they'd hired an English actor and dressed the actor up as Darwin. During the filming, as Dawkins says it, I opened a door and greeted Darwin. He and I then entered into a discussion out of time. I presented modern neo-Darwinist ideas, and Darwin acted astounded, delighted, and surprised. There are indeed indications that Darwin would have been pleased about this modern way of looking at his ideas, because we know he was very troubled by genetics all his life. In Darwin's time, nobody understood genetics except Mendel, but Darwin never read Mendel, practically nobody read Mendel. If only Darwin had read Mendel, a gigantic piece of the jigsaw would have clicked into place. And he goes on to say the problems that Darwin had with issues around blended inheritance and why that didn't work out and why he needed the Mendelian model. These are two critical questions that I want you to think about. What kind of Darwin is Dawkins putting forward? What's his vision of Darwin? And what kind of a man does he want Darwin to be? I was wondering who had had the most biographies written of them and where Darwin stood in the pecking order, so to speak. Now, it turns out that if you do a Google search on this, you just throw up a load of garbage. It's actually really hard to get any forms of metrics. So I thought I'd go and play around on the British Library catalogue website to see what I could find, using the catalogue to try and get some form of metrics. In general, there's very few books that you won't be able to find in the British Library. So what I'm doing here is a basic subject search. Let's start off seeing where Darwin is in this. And I've thrown up the best part of 113 books, everything in this catalogue. You can already see from looking at this screen that it's a slightly inaccurate way of doing metrics. There are things that you'd want to exclude. Okay, well, let's try another search and see how he compares with, say, Newton, Isaac, chug, chug, chug. And here we see far less written about him. 44 on the subject. Most of these are in English, so someone as important as Newton is not rating that highly. Let's try another one of our pantheon. William Harvey, discoverer of circulation of the blood. And in fact, we've not got very much there at all. Let's try one of the most famous scientists of all time. Einstein, biography. 104, some of it may have been about Einstein. So someone like Einstein, by this measure, is in the same zone as Darwin, but not as high. Let's try some really famous people like Winston Churchill. Now we're talking 191. He's definitely gone into the lead. Maybe he's antagonist, Hitler, Adolf. Now you're smoking. 289, 287 about it. Yep, so Hitler has gone into the lead. And let's try one more famous person. Christ. Well, we don't know how many of those are biographies, but I think we have a winner. But I think that you can see from this that Darwin has been written about an incredible amount. But what is it we read when we read a biography? What do we think we're getting? Do we imagine that somehow we are seeing, reading, understanding the real person, that we've got the real Charles Darwin to stand up? I'm not sure what the contract is between the biographer and the reader, but I think certainly the reader quite often insists that the real so-and-so, Stalin, Hitler, Churchill, Darwin, is made to stand up. They want to feel that they're getting a glimpse of the real individual. But given all of that, the question still remains, why on earth do we need so many biographies of Darwin? What is happening when we produce all of these biographies? Where is the room for all of this different interpretation? What is the motivation for people to keep writing them? And this is the critical question that I now want you to think about. I want to just give another view of Darwin and biography, and why the extent to which Darwin has been focused upon as a biographical figure in the history of Victorian science can be deeply problematic. This is the historian of biology, Jim Endersby, who wrote a review article in the Journal of the History of Biology in 2003 called Escaping Darwin's Shadows. This is what he says. Picture yourself standing in the doorway of a vast 19th century museum, akin to one of the great Victorian natural history museums, a cathedral to the imperial sciences of collecting, classifying and describing. The ceiling of the cavernous main room is supported by a small forest of pillars, and between these are hundreds of alcoves and side rooms, crowded with innumerable objects that trace the history of these sciences. Now, as I've indicated here, Endersby may well have been thinking of the Oxford University Museum that opened in 1860 and was the scene of the great debate between Bishop Samuel Wilberforce and Huxley himself, debating about the validity of Darwin's thesis that had been put forward a few months before in 1859 in Origin of Species. It's an amazing building, the Oxford Museum. You can see from this image that it's got this glass roof embedded in lattice work that allows for light to pour down into the museum. It's like a cathedral built to the sciences. But it's hard to see the detail of this astonishing collection because the museum has only a single light, a dazzlingly bright, almost incandescent beacon that hangs in the very middle of the Great Hall. Your eyes are drawn to it immediately, but the intense white light dazzles, and as you turn away to look at the collections, blinking hastily, the after image of the central lantern floats before you, imprinting itself on everything that you try to look at. And indeed, if you're looking at the exhibits in the Oxford Museum and you look up, you can be dazzled in this way, as you can see from this rather nifty black and white photograph of a dinosaur that I took when I was there in 2009. The big light is Charles Darwin, and the museum he illuminates so harshly is the history of 19th century sciences, and especially of natural history. There's no doubt that he deserves his central position in the Great Hall, but in recent decades so much energy has gone into Darwin's studies that his influence has distorted our understanding of the entire period. The figure of Darwin, the biographies of Darwin, do so much to be that dazzling light, so bright that everything around it gets cast into the shadow. And it's our task to bring the people and the ideas in the shadows back into that light. And that's something that we'll be doing during the course of this subject. And I also want to point out that one of the reasons it's important to study the relationship between Darwin and biography is to understand that biography can have this incredibly distorting effect, focusing upon the great man or occasionally the great woman at the expense of all the social and cultural forces and all the other individuals that have gone into making an idea.